Good day from eBizRadio.com. I'm Nick von Stein. eBiz Radio is the place to go if you want to know about the world of business and the business of the world. I've got Jayson O'Reilly with me from Atvance Intellect. We're going to be discussing the recently enacted POPI Act in a South African context, as well as in regards to data. Interesting topic today, Jayson.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. Hi, and to your listeners as well. I think it's a great topic. It's something that I think South Africa needs because the rest of the world's already got it, and I think it just gives the consumer, it gives you and me the peace of mind, and I think that's why I think it's a great topic.
Okay, so let's talk about the Act itself. It broadly aligns itself with the European version of itself. We'll go into details on that in a moment. But also, it's been actually passed for a while, but it's only being implemented recently, as you said, within the last week.
Yeah, I mean, the POPI Act, there was a conversation that started in 2013, right? So it's taken 7 years to get to this point. Obviously appointing a regulator. I think the biggest thing that, most people may not be aware of is, it's all fine and well to, create laws and rules. But who's going to enforce those rules? Because otherwise the people that are meant to actually, abide by those rules just effectively shrug their shoulders and go, oh, well, nothing's going to happen anyway, right? Because that's generally how Mama Africa behaves. And, unfortunately, if things are not enforced, it proves to be a challenge. And I think, the regulator has taken their time to get this thing done. And, now effectively people have got 12 months to comply. So it's great. I think it's good for people and their personal information because privacy, personal information, everybody's talking about 5G and, how am I going to be affected? What are the risks? The nice thing is that this law really starts to put accountability in the hands of the people that utilize our data and how they use it.
So let's talk about its European companion, which is what it's largely based on, because obviously we want to have especially a digital presence in the EU. It's good for our economy if South African businesses are operating in the EU. And so we broadly follow the European guidelines. Talk to us about the European version of this law and how it inspired our law.
Yeah, absolutely. So GDPR is probably one of the closest brothers or sisters to our law, and obviously from a European perspective, one of the things is the adoption of digital in the rest of the world has really been very progressive. And if we start to think about all the things associated not only to data, but different governments, different continents, different regulations, areas where your data may end up, it really brings it back to the fact that you need to have some form of regulation or law that talks about how people can use it. And the European law is by no means the most stringent. The South African POPI Act is far more stringent, and I think it's going to be quite tough for organizations to comply to. However, they haven't made it impossible. In fact, we've taken the likes of those European programs and we've beefed it up on steroids, even though, we're not as progressive, with all due respect, as progressive as European, the European Union or, those specific countries that effectively bring on digital, right? But I think what we have done is we've allowed specifically for the progression and digital transformation to be safely done moving forward. There was also another one that was recently brought out, which was the California privacy law as well. And between the California privacy law and POPI, those two are very, very closely managed. And that really starts to say to those that process citizens' data or customers' data that you've got to take it seriously, because the reality is on the dark web or on the web where data is currency, personal information is the highest grossing obviously grossing currency. So you can understand why these regulations are pretty have been brought into place. But it's also you've got to understand that in a digital economy and in digital space, there are no borders. What one law is in Kazakhstan is not one law in South Africa, right? So, these are the kind of regulations that effectively globally are being rolled out to manage the citizen and help the citizen when your my information are transacted in any way, shape, and form. So look, there's a number of these regulations out there, but the most important thing is it creates accountability for those that use our data and infringe on our privacy, and I think that is very important.
Let's go into some details then on the law within South African context. What protections does it enable for people?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's eight simple conditions, right? And those conditions effectively can quite easily be found on the POPI Act-compliance.co.za website, and that gives you a really good view as to what it is. And it talks about 8 key principles or conditions. 1, accountability. Create accountability to those that utilize the information and process your information, right? Processing limitation. So processing limitations means that whatever I gather your information for, I've got to use it for that purpose and that purpose only. There's another, obviously, condition which talks about purpose specific, and that gives you further breakdown. Which is important because I'll give you an idea. I mean, we log on to applications. Applications are becoming a standard today, right? We log on to these applications, we put in username, passwords, and potentially, because of the way that passwords work, we put those username and passwords in other applications, right? Not knowing where our data is going and not knowing how that data is used. But because we want the convenience of the application, we give them our information. What POPI really starts to do is, if you're transacting in South African citizen information, you are privy to this law. In other words, if you break these laws, you can effectively either have a jail sentence or you can stand a fine of up to 10 million rand. So, which is pretty key. So it's important that the purpose of why you're gathering the data is to utilize it for the purpose of your business and not on sell it to other businesses, which potentially, believe it or not, happens in more cases you can understand. Processing limitations. So again, that just extends on that. So if you reuse personal information and it's not compatible with the purpose why you got the information, everything that they do basically highlights that you've got to get the data subject's permission, which is great, right? So that means that, if I'm a Vodacom customer, I'm not all of a sudden going to be getting all these marketing calls from Vodacom subsidiaries, right? The reason I signed up with Vodacom, I either ticked yes, contact me or not. So, sorry, Vodacom's a great example or a bad example, however you see it. But when you're talking about the millions of customers they have, it's a great example. But with POPI, what it does is it enforces the capability for, if somebody's going to utilize your information, they've got to ask you first, which is great, because again, if information is the data currency or the digital currency on the dark web, you want to be asked permission first before you decide to say, hey, listen, no worries. Information quality, which is effectively number 5, talks about the information that they gather needs to be reliable and accurate at all times. So that really is going to start ensuring that the information and how it's housed and where it's housed ideally is maintained and it is looked after by the relevant people, the data custodian. Number 6, which is something called openness. I like openness because it's something that generally in South Africa we don't tend to do, right? Depending on who you're transacting with. For example, and the great example for me is in all of these cyber attacks that we've been talking about, whether ransomware or phishing or email fraud or whatever we've spoken about over our series, is if for some reason our information is breached or is stolen from that organization's got to let you know. I think it's in between 72 hours or between 48 and 72 hours. There needs to be official communication by that company advising you that your data has now been stolen or that your data integrity, which they own, has been breached, which is great because as a consumer, you can start to make better decisions on who's transacting your data, your value, and more importantly, is it the right company you want to effectively do your business with, or you want to transact with, or you want to utilize their application. I think the openness conversation is really important because that starts to build accountability internally. Because effectively, we saw with a couple of breaches that have happened over the past years, is we talk about reputational damage. We talk about the ability for consumers to make decisions based on their information and the services that they require. You want the ability to do that. And nobody should hide things from you and go bankrupt tomorrow or have a breach and your information is flooded all over the internet and you don't know, right? The other component is security safeguards. So security is a big one because, one of the things that we've really been struggling with, in fact, I was privy to a conversation pretty recently with a number of CISOs. And one of the biggest struggles they were having is how do we show success in cybersecurity and security safeguards? Because the only real time the business sits up and pays attention is when the world ends, right? And in fact, it's easy. Somebody said it's sometimes easier to deal with an angrier person because they now get why you're there, as opposed to in the beginning where we spoke about why we need these things in place. So security safeguards are critical, but it's also going to start helping the businesses start to understand why those security safeguards in place and adhere better to their own internal policies. Again, coming back to their accountability program. And for the consumer or for the person who has made the information available to the company, it basically says, I know that I'm working with that organization and they're adhering to those security safeguards, which is great. And then the last one is obviously participation. And that's all about, you may request that your information may or may not be held by that company, which, by the way, is going to cause a nightmare for South African organizations and anybody, because you can actually require, if you're no longer consumer service, you can, in writing, send an email or ideally telephonically, however best they're going to process it, you can say, I have the right to be forgotten and I have the right to be deleted from your database. And now organizations need to figure out, oh my Lord, where is your information? Is it in this country? Is it in that country? Because they also use different services. Now, that's going to start. I mean, we in conversations we've had, that is the biggest challenge we have, and organizations have, is where is your data? And as a customer, where is your data housed? Because I need to go and find that because you've asked me to forget you or delete you. So, those are the 8 principles, and they're quite simple, but they're quite onerous for the organization that's happy to take your money. Now the point is we as consumers and we as people who effectively value our privacy, this is POPI. POPI is here to help us and make sure that we hold those accountable that transact our data.
And I think is that maybe why it's taken so long to implement, because government knew government knew how difficult it would be for businesses to implement such laws.
I don't think the thought was how difficult it would be for businesses to implement those laws. There's been a lot of consultation that's taken place. Again, there's always a challenge as to who do you align with, where do you align, how do you create your own policies? Do you align like we've done very simply with the likes of the EU guidelines? Do we align with American guidelines, China guidelines, Russian guidelines? So I think putting together the law is always a struggle. And you've also got, they've done, just the regulator and, the legal fraternity behind the law have really looked at, how do we put together a law that looks at the data and the individual, how that data today is currently abused and potentially how it impacts the data owner. But then more importantly, how do we then, effectively safeguard that information and provide the right guidelines? Because, one of the things about POPI is that it is relevant to everybody. There is nobody that can hide from POPI, right? What's quite funny, and I think we always talk about this, is when you drive into a complex, and I'm sure you've done this, you drive into a complex and the first thing they do is they scan your ID. You say, okay, they've scanned my ID into this machine. Not a problem. You write down on a piece of paper, you put your telephone number, you sometimes put your ID number, you put your address, and this is just to go and visit a person in the complex. Anybody that knows what POPI is there to define, at the end of the day, on the way out of that complex, you can say, all right, I now need you to delete my information from whatever system you put it on. The problem that you have is when we start looking at the law is, because it applies to everybody, nobody is effectively able to dodge the law. If they transact in your data, they've got to abide by the law. And that is important, because now it means that people are going to take your and my data a lot more seriously, and how they go about protecting. Coming back to cyber and how people protect data, there are organizations out there that do cybersecurity, and then there are organizations out there that do cybersecurity, right? And I think that's where the difference we're going to see is you've got to have a reasonable standard of protecting your information and your IP and your organization, and that standard is going to now be elevated because of the law. And that's what we're excited about, because you walk into one company today and we talk about maturity models. Some people just don't care. They have basic controls in place. They don't care how they transact with the data. They don't care how they transact with their employees' information. And they do what they think is the best because of their knowledge. With the law in place, you've got to do as the law dictates that you have, and there are guidelines, and I think that's what's important.
So back to a little bit on Atvance then. How have you guys approached the implementation of the law?
Yeah, I mean, so to give you an idea, so internally, everything starts with a policy, and we know that, right? So every organization is different in how they transact with data, understanding what data they consume, where that data goes, how it works across their networks, and who has access to that data. Establishing a policy is important, and I was also part of a group pretty recently. There's a lot of these policies that are available for $1.99 on the internet. One of the critical things is don't go and get a policy for the sake of a policy. Go and get a policy, because that's the first step. And the policy needs to be informed by what you and how you work as an organization. And there are some really good companies in South Africa and obviously globally as well that have focused on POPI and POPI coming. So it's quite easy. Start with the policy. Once you've got the policy will help understand how the data is accessed and how it is transmitted. Once that you understand that, then you can start to put in the right controls, and those controls predominantly are who accesses the information, how are they able to share the information, how are they able to transact with the information, and more importantly, how is the information housed. And that's what your policy defines. So get the policy right. That is it. So that has been our focus, obviously, for the last probably 3 to 4 months, getting the policy right. We're very fortunate we're the cybersecurity arm of the Atvance group. We've got some great controls in place today, purely because, we take cybersecurity and we believe in eating our dog food a little bit more seriously than most. But, what is important, and I think in any audit type situation, your auditor or the regulator just wants to know that you are doing the best that you can with the revenue that you have available to spend on being compliant, and then more importantly, measure it. So, what will happen, and we'll see this progression over time, is you can't say, well, I've got my policy in place and I've got the basics in place. Because next year, you've not only got to have the basics in place, you've got to have the basics plus 1. And you've eventually got to have the basics plus 2, basics plus 3, as long as you are showing every year that your compliance to the regulation is getting better. Nobody's expecting anybody to go and spend R1 billion on security technologies and data housing solutions and backup, and nobody's expecting that. What it is at the end of the day, it's reasonable man thinking is, how do I move myself from where I am today to getting myself more compliant tomorrow? As a business and as the cyber division of the Atvance Group and Atvance Intellect, what we do at the end of the day is we work with customers on automating that program and providing the measurement and metrics. We've got some really smart technologies. So we help a customer move from the establishment of a policy to the measurement of the program. Because one of the things that you do need to show is that, you're getting better, but more importantly, how you're measuring and how you're managing the program. And I think, we do that for small businesses and we do that for enterprises. And I think that's one of the things that organizations need to take into account is all you have to show is that you're getting better at what you're doing. You don't have to throw 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, 20 million, 60 million at the problem. you have to show that you're getting better at what you're doing and how you're transacting the data. And, from a business perspective, with us, obviously establishing an entity in Amsterdam as well as in the UK, we've now got multiple regulations. The great thing that we do as a business is we don't care what the regulation is. We can show that you're what we term as audit to green, with regards to any standard or regulation. And I think that's important because many organizations look at their growth strategy, but this comes back to your policy. If your policy of your business is aligned with your business objectives and how you're working as a business, if you don't transact across multiple domains, well, then you just need to be compliant for the domain that you're responsible for. And what we do as a business, and there are others out there as well, is we look at where you are in your policy. How do we help protect against that policy? And then more importantly, how do we secure the data for you as an organization, utilizing the reasonable man syndrome of knowing how you do that? And which is I think a great value for many customers out there, but it's getting your head around how this actually complies to you. There's nowhere to hide today. If you're transacting in customer information, you have to be POPI compliant.
Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing, Jayson?
No, from my perspective, this isn't. I think this is like an elephant, right? How do you eat an elephant? There's always that conversation. One small bite at a time. You're going to eventually get to eating the whole elephant. The point is, start the journey. Work with the right people on the journey. Get the right information. That is the most important thing with POPI. There are so many fearmongers out there. They talk about, you've got to do this fear, uncertainty, and doubt concept. Yes, you have to comply. You don't have a choice. It is the law. You've got 12 months to comply. Put a program in place. Work with the right people to put a program in place. Advance Intellect is there to help. We work with obviously advisors as well as internally. We've now recently in the process of establishing a privacy business, and that is there to help people with the legal aspect and how do you go about doing this properly. So again, one small bite at a time, and reach out to your community and do this in the best possible way.
Jayson O'Reilly from Atvance Intellect, thank you so much for your time today.
Chris, thank you, and have a good weekend, and same to your listeners.